Hello, I'm Mat McLachlan, and thank you for joining me today for this very special event to commemorate Remembrance Day. The past couple of years have been a difficult time for everyone, and it's been the longest period of the last 2 decades that I haven't walked in the footsteps of the Anzacs on a foreign battlefield. This bunker is the closest I've been to a trench for 2 years. But with light at the end of the tunnel almost here and international travel reopening, I can't wait to get back over there next year. And I'd like to invite you to join me. Looking around this bunker, walking through a trench, looking at photos or watching a documentary, you can begin to imagine what it was like for the soldiers on the battlefields. But there's nothing like walking the ground where our significant battles took place, where the Anzac legend was born, to bring this history to life. Today, I want to share with you how you can join me in honouring all those who've served in the armed forces. Through living history podcasts, documentaries and books, but most excitingly, through our range of 2022 Mat McLachlan battlefield tours. Whether it's the hallowed beaches of Gallipoli, the rolling fields of the Somme or the jungles of Vietnam, a visit to an Australian battlefield is always a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Today we'll take you virtually to some of Australia's most significant battlefields.
November 11 marks Remembrance Day, where the armistice was signed that ended the First World War, and that took place on the Western Front. So that's a great place for us to start. Let's go to the Western Front. Let's talk to our historian who leads all our Western Front tours. It's Pete Smith. Pete, thanks for joining us from the Western Front.
Hey, Matt. Nice to be with you.
Mate, where are you now? I can see you're not inside. You're obviously out and about on the battlefields. Where exactly are you?
Yeah, well, I'm standing in the Commonwealth War Grave Cemetery very close to my house, Bulls Road Cemetery. So one of those Commonwealth War Grave cemeteries scattered across the battlefields of the Western Front.
It's one of the most fascinating aspects of visiting the Western Front, Pete, are those incredible cemeteries. Everyone tells a different story. They're a very emotive place to visit. Do you ever get sick of visiting cemeteries, considering you go to so many of them on the battlefields?
It's a very good question. No, I don't. They're all so different, and they're also very moving. But I like that difference in the styles of the cemeteries. It's one of the interesting things I get asked quite often. Which cemetery do I prefer? It depends on the time of the year. It depends on how I'm feeling even. But no, everyone is interesting. Sadly, the remains of the soldiers obviously are buried within them. But that's part of I suppose the enjoyment is researching those men and bringing them back to life again.
I can tell by your accent, Pete, that you're not originally an Australian, but you lead all of our Australian passengers on the battlefields. How does a Brit like yourself relate to this Aussie history?
Well, it's very easy, really. It's helped by my clients to a certain extent. They bring the history with them. I then enhance the history by taking them to the places that they're interested in. But it's something that's always interested me, and I suppose it's easier with the Australians because the service records are available. So it also brings the men alive when you can see all of their service records. Sadly, for the British soldiers, we're not able to access them in most cases because they were destroyed in the bombing of the Second World War. So that being able to look at the service files, to bring people that are very interested in their history, it just brings it alive for me, and hopefully I bring it alive for them.
Well, I know that you certainly do, Pete. We get amazing feedback about the job that you do. And people who are watching this may have tuned in to listen to us on our Battle Walks podcast that we do every week where we walk the battlefields. I've got to say something I'm really excited about is as of next year, in September next year, I'm coming over there and you and I are going to be leading a tour together, the Mat McLachlan Signature Tour. It's going to be great fun, mate. I can't wait to actually walk the battlefields with you in person.
No, I'm looking forward to it immensely with this long, almost... a 2-year layoff yeah, it's great to be back on the battlefield, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Let's talk about some of the Australian sites that people most want to visit when they go to the battlefields, because this is the real opportunity of visiting the Western Front to learn about the Anzacs, to learn what the Australians did between 1916 and 1918. So the first one that many Australians want to see is probably the most tragic story. That's the battlefield of Fromelles. Tell us about the experience of visiting Fromelles.
Yeah, well, Fromelles a great place to go to. Obviously, not it's a very sad place to go to, but it's because there's so many different aspects of it to look at. You've got VC Corner Cemetery, where the men that were recovered are buried, initially recovered, are buried there. We now have the new cemetery of Pheasant Wood, which a recent recovery of burials from a mass grave, so we can go and have a look at the men that are buried there. Then there's the battlefield itself, and the famous Cobbers Memorial, which is exceptional Sergeant Fraser carrying his wounded comrade over his shoulder. So we can go and explore that site as well. And now we have the new museum. So there's a museum there dedicated to the Battle of Fromelles. So you've got all those aspects, pull them together, and it's a great place to go and explore.
Another place that I always love going to when I'm on the battlefields is the Ypres Salient up in the north in Belgium. And probably Hill 60 is the most famous site within the Ypres Salient. Tell us what it's like to walk amongst the smashed pillboxes and ruined trenches on Hill 60.
Well, because there's so little of the original battlefield for us to see, Hill 60 is very special. It's got to be one of the most interesting places to go, to actually walk on the ground, which is still the original ground. It's not been ploughed, it's not been levelled. So we are actually walking on part of the battlefield. Connection to Australia, of course, because of the tunnels beneath and the mine that was detonated during the Battle of Messines. So it just adds that extra dimension, that ability to walk on the battlefield, to walk in the craters and the shell holes and look at the bunkers that have been left.
And finally, of course, Pete, the Australian National Memorial at Villers-Bretonneux. No trip to the Western Front would be complete without visiting that. Some new additions lately to that site. So it's a site that's been there for nearly 100 years, and now there's some brand new additions to the site as well.
Yeah, I mean, the Sir John Monash Centre that's been added to the memorial to the missing of France, which is, I mean, it's a fantastic memorial to go and have a look at, designed by Lucian. So it was a wonderful thing to go and see anyway. But you can climb the tower. But now to go behind it into the new Sir John Monash Centre, wonderful. I mean, to go and get the full experience of Australians on the Western Front. The only downside is the amount of time that you need there, because there is so much to see and to do.
Well, Pete, there's so many wonderful Australian sites on the battlefield. Thank you so much for bringing them alive for so many Australian visitors. A whole range of tours that people can do with you to walk those sites. But we're just really excited about getting back there in 2022 and walking the ground in the footsteps of the Anzacs.
Oh, I can't wait, Matt. I just can't wait.
From one of our oldest battlefields to one of our more recent ones, we're going to go from the Western Front to Vietnam. And joining us is a dear friend of mine and someone who knows all about the tough fighting that existed in Vietnam. It's Vietnam veteran Gary McKay. Gary, you were a platoon commander in Vietnam, and I won't ask you what that experience was like, because I'm sure that would be very difficult to put into words. But what does a day like today mean for you? Remembrance Day as a veteran. How significant is this for veterans of previous conflicts?
Oh, it's very important. It's an opportunity for us to honour those that we serve with, and especially those who fell on the field of battle, and in my situation, to remember the men from my platoon who have passed away since we returned from active service. Very important.
This year marked 50 years since the battle you fought in Nui Le, the battle where you were wounded and where you were awarded the Military Cross, and also where, of course, the last Australians killed in action in Vietnam fell. Does it feel 50 years later, mate? Does it feel that long to you?
Well, it's funny, I was only thinking about that the other day, and on the anniversary of the battle in September, and that day is etched in my memory banks. And I think, without too much purple prose, it's seared into my soul, because none of us thought that we were going to get out of that battle alive that day, because of the fact that we were so outnumbered by the enemy. It's still vivid in my memory.
And after all these years, how do you look back on those men that you fought alongside, and particularly the men that you lost on that battlefield? Because you were all young men then, you were all in your early 20s. It's been a lot of time, a lot of water under the bridge since then. How do you look back over this bridge of years to those men that you fought with, and particularly the ones that you lost?
For the ones that I lost, with sadness, because they never got to have a life like the rest of us, like the survivors did. And for those who did make it back, I look upon them with love and affection, to be honest, because we all went through something pretty special, and it created a bond, born in that crucible of fire, I guess.
I had the privilege, mate, 5 years ago to travel back to Vietnam with you and a group of veterans for the Long Tan anniversary. And that was an extremely moving experience for me, but it also was for the veterans as well. You've been back lots of times to Vietnam. What is that experience like, taking veterans back for the first time, taking family members back for the first time, and trying to make people understand a little bit about what it was like?
It's at times it can be challenging, especially for the guys that saw heavy combat and who, you know, might themselves have been wounded or they lost good mates, like many of us did. But getting them and their families or their partners to understand what war fighting is about and what it was like in Vietnam at that time is rewarding in a way, very rewarding. And I see that in their faces at the end of the day. You know, when we finish touring the battlefield and we're back in the hotel, you can see it in their eyes. And, you know, we stand at the bar and have a beer and toast our fallen mates. It makes it all worthwhile.
It's also not just for veterans and veterans' families. There were a lot of people on our tour, the majority of people had no direct connection. Is it important that we bring people on these tours who didn't serve in the war to broaden the understanding of the Vietnam War?
Yeah, on the last tour before COVID, I had a couple of veterans from Afghanistan, and they'd been in the commando unit and they decided to come and have a look at Vietnam. They were a bit gobsmacked when we went through Cu Chi tunnels and over to where Operation Bribey was, because they didn't really understand until then what it was like to fight in close country. All of their engagements in Afghanistan had been over hundreds of metres, and all of a sudden they were confronted with the fact that our contacts were between 10 and 15 metres on average. So it was an eye-opener. And for those who are just coming to see what it was all about, it's important. And I try really hard to get the correct balance about what it was like for us as allies and for the enemy, the Viet Cong and the NVA, how they had to fight as well.
Well, part of you telling your story, Gary, is going to take place in a new book that we're publishing very soon in conjunction with you that you've written for us, called After the Blood Cools, which tells your story and also talks about how you dealt with your Vietnam experiences. Tell us a little bit about the book and why it was important for you to write it.
It's a bit sad in a way, because everyone is now aware of the post-Iraq and the post-Afghanistan suicide rates that are now inflicting upon those veterans. And what I wanted to do was make people aware of what a soldier goes through on the field of battle, and then what happens to him afterwards. Not a year later, but many years later. In my own case, I didn't really have any after effects, mentally anyway, for about 30 years. And then after an incident that happened in Vietnam, all of a sudden I started having flashbacks and nightmares and so on. And I thought, oh, that'll never happen to me. You know, I'm a Bronze Anzac, decorated Vietnam veteran, blah, blah. But I was wrong. And so I wanted to write about what it's like for soldiers, as the title suggests, after the blood cools. Because, you know, we ask a lot of warriors. We're asking them to do something that is abnormal. They have to go out, close with and kill the enemy. And yet we expect them then to behave normally when that's all over. But the stresses of fear, grief, shock and horror are too much sometimes. And it's important that we look after the veterans who come back. And you don't have to have just been a warrior for that to happen. You can be someone who's a medic or in a field hospital or flying choppers or whatever to be impacted by what happens on the battlefield.
Well, it's an important story, Gary, and we're really grateful that you've shared it with us, both in the book and also by walking the ground in Vietnam. And thank you for coming on today on Remembrance Day and sharing your story.
Oh, you're welcome, Matt. Thank you for having me.
Australian soldiers have a lot of experience fighting in jungles all over the world. And now from the jungles of Vietnam, we're going to go to a very different jungle environment, Kokoda, in World War II. And joining us is a historian who has trekked the Kokoda track more than 60 times. It's David Howell. David, thank you very much for joining us.
Great to be here, man.
Now, you've spent a lot of time on the track. How much does walking Kokoda, climbing those mountains, traversing those creeks, how much does that give you an experience, an understanding of what the soldiers went through in 1942?
I think about Kokoda, it's immensely important for people to walk the ground because you experience the same trials and tribulations when it comes to your personal self in terms of exhaustion, in terms of what it is to put one foot in front of the other. The ground is largely unchanged 80 years later.
We hear that it's a really grueling experience to spend 10 or 11 days trekking across the Owen Stanleys. Do you have to be a super athlete to do it, or is it something that the average person can realistically expect to achieve?
I think for the average person, it is very much realistically a thing that one could achieve. I stress the point that it is more mental than it is physical. And what I mean by that is that you can't just go and crash on the lounge, turn on Facebook, turn on the TV, etc. When you're out there, it's 24/7 in a jungle environment and something that is far removed from our everyday lives. So I would suggest that even really super fit people could find that a challenge. So it's a combination of both being physical, but as I said, I think more mentally.
You must have taken a lot of family members with you, David, who are walking in the footsteps of a relative who's fought. What's that experience like for people to know that their father or grandfather was there before them?
That for me is one of the most wonderful journeys that I take with people. And there's nothing that makes me more prouder than to sit down at the end of the day around the campfire and to pull out a piece of history, maybe a quote from the person, maybe a diary entry if you're lucky, and you start to see that the relatives start to gel. It starts to gel with them. The stories that their grandfather or father told them, perhaps some of the things that they left out, it all starts to sink in. And when they get back, most of them say to me, look, I could never have imagined what it would have been like before doing this trip, to say, this is what Pop went through, or this is what my dad went through, and to think about how hard it would have been for him during those dark days of Australian history.
People on the trek must discover a few things about themselves, David, not just about the history. What's that experience like when people get to the end of Kokoda after having spent 10, 11, 12 days in the mountains?
I think for a lot of people who don't have regular communication when they're on the track, so there's no getting on the phone, getting an email, they really think about their own place in the world. In particular, they think about family, past and present, but certainly I've had grown men finish, get under the archway at either end, wherever we finish, and they have tears rolling down their eyes. The emotions that come out of a person, not just about the history, but also about looking inside themselves, really come to the fore. And you have to remember, there are hours where you are just you. You're at peace with the jungle and you have your inner monologue and your thoughts to keep you company. And I think that's when we really stop, take time out of the modern world and really get in touch with, I guess, the most important thing for an individual, and that's oneself.
You mentioned, David, the history and how important it is to connect with that history. And we've got some photos here we're going to show, some then and now images of what Kokoda was like during the Second World War and what people can expect to experience today. Just talk us through some of these because they're very compelling issues. So this first one of Eora Creek.
Well, Eora Creek, first of all, for the trek, for most of it, you can hear it. Certainly for about half of the trek, it is there at night. There is no mistake. In fact, some people say keeps them awake. It is a huge river system that is very cold. It comes from the top of the mountain, and a lot of the campsites are along the river, and you can, as I said, hear it raging all through the night. However, almost 80 years to the day, Australians fought the largest battle, which was fought in the Owen Stanley Range, and probably the one that gets the least attention. Is when the Australians were pushing the Japanese back out of the mountains down towards the beaches, and it was the most bloodthirstiest battle that one could imagine in the jungles of New Guinea. And the creek, Eora Creek itself, features in it. I mean, Australians, mainly New South Welshmen from the 16th Brigade, had to cross that creek at night to do a full frontal attack on entrenched Japanese soldiers. And guess what? The moon came out and shone down onto the log bridges, which were later washed away as the Australians were trying to cross. And a lot of Australians found themselves stranded, cut off on the Japanese side of the creek. So the Eora Creek features heavily in the history, and also when one undertakes the trek.
David, we're looking at this photograph here showing Australian troops demonstrating just how difficult the terrain is. This is probably one of the most famous points on the Kokoda track. This is Ishirava. Tell us a little bit about what the soldiers went through there and what we can expect to experience today.
Ishirava was really important because it is the point in time where the militia, or the reserve Australian soldiers, if you will, met the AIF. And it was here that the Australians made a stand. And on 29 August 1942, it was the place where the first Victoria Cross was awarded for gallantry on Australian soil. And if a modern day trekker visits this site, they will see the magnificent Ishirava War Memorial. And I've been to a lot of war memorials around the world, but to stand there, look through down to the Yotta Valley, you will see these 4 granite pillars, which sum up the sentiments of the Kokoda campaign. They are courage, endurance, mateship, and sacrifice. And all of those 4 sentiments, if you will, not only sum up the battle, but in part, they sum up the journey of every trekker that goes across Kokoda.
And of course, David, visiting these battlefields isn't just about the trek and the jungle and sleeping out and crossing rivers. It's also paying respects to the men that died. And that's what this photo shows us here. This last photo is Bamana, which is the home of the war cemetery where many of the men killed in the Kokoda campaign now lie. What's the experience like to visit Bamana today and to pay your respects to those men who died?
I think it's a very humbling experience. There's over 3,500 graves, 600 of which have known unto God. So there is no known grave. And in particular, there is a grave there with a chap named Joe Rawkin, who was from Sydney, and he was only 16 years of age. And every group I take there, I go to that headstone, and I think to myself, and I instill into the others that are with me, think about how many years that you have on that young 16-year-old boy and the sacrifice that he made for this great country.
That's a great point. These are the things we have to remember about the Kokoda campaign. David, I know you're going to be back there in 2022, trekking across the Owen Stanleys yet again, adding to that tally of 60 crossings you've already made. It's going to be a wonderful experience. We're looking forward to people being able to join you. And just thank you so much for joining us to share your thoughts today.
Thanks, Matt.
I'd like to welcome back our historians for a very special panel. Each historian has talked about the battlefields where they lead tours and the significance of walking that ground. But now I wanted to bring them all together to talk about it collectively as a group, a very special panel to talk about the significance of walking the ground. It's one thing to read a history book or watch a documentary or even participate in an event like this one, but it's another thing to get out there in the fields, to strap the boots on and actually walk the ground where the Anzacs fought and died. So it's really great to have them back. And Pete, especially you, I see that you've left the cemetery and you've now come home. So thank you for making that mad dash to join us back from your home.
No problem, Matt. Not too far.
I'm going to start with you actually, Pete, because you deal with the Western Front, battlefields for the First World War. This is the conflict the furthest back in time. So obviously there's no veterans left anymore. I think it would be unusual to even find family members who had talked about the experience of war with their veteran relative. Isn't it still important, Pete, that people come out and walk the ground even if they don't have that direct connection?
It's absolutely essential. It's great reading about it, and I enjoy reading books about warfare. But to actually walk on the ground, especially if you have a relative, or just if you're just interested, to walk the ground where the soldiers walked and where in some cases they fell, It's just extraordinary. And you get that immediate connection. And it can be surprisingly an emotional connection to many, many people as they bend down, literally. And some people do this, bend down and actually touch the ground with their hand, or at the very least walk off the walkway, the track that they're on, onto the actual soil of the paddock, of the field. And suddenly you're there. You're there exactly where your relative for the Western Front fought over 100 years ago. It is a real emotional connection for many people.
Pete, what you're describing there sounds like hallowed ground. Gary, I want to ask you, is it the same in Vietnam? Because that's a much more recent conflict. You travel with a lot of veterans from the conflict and their families who would have shared stories. Is it still that same experience of walking a hallowed ground and learning new elements about the conflict?
Absolutely. Whenever we have a memorial service at the Long Tan battle site where the cross is, there's never a dry eye in the house. And it doesn't have to be a veteran. It can be, the next of kin, or it can be even people who have very little connection with the Second Indochina War. It's the fact that they are on the ground where people fought and died. And that really drives home hard to a lot of people. And it has the expected outcome. People do get emotional about it. It's very important that they can connect as well.
David, your battlefield, Kokoda, is a World War II battlefield. It's somewhere in the middle of those two conflicts. What's the experience like for people when they come and walk that ground, and particularly considering it's pretty tough ground they have to walk?
Yeah, Matt, I think, I echo both the sentiments of Gary and Pete, but one thing about Kokoda, which you can't get in a book, is the majesty of the mountains. To stand there, even at Kokoda, and look up at the Owen Stanley Range and just see how big it is just something that you cannot get in a book. And when you walk the ground, even though 80 years has gone by, you still hear the sounds, smell the smells, and feel the wind on your face of the jungle, just like the diggers did, 80 years ago. And that experience in itself, I don't think you can get no matter how hard an author tries in a book. It's just something you have to experience.
Yeah, I agree.
I totally agree. Yeah. People are in Vietnam,
I'm going to
and
throw
all of a
that.
sudden they've got the heat and humidity. It covers you like a big blanket, and you can't escape from it. And it's with you 24/7 while you're on tour. And it's just a reminder of how tough it was soldiering in that type of environment.
I'm going to throw it as a bit of an open question to all of you. How close can we legitimately get to the experience of the men who fought on that battlefield?
Well, without firing rounds overhead, it's pretty hard. But I think if you can, when we go up to the long high hills and we actually climb up to the top of the mountain, and we go through those huge granite boulders that are pockmarked with shrapnel, and we travel in single file up through there, people get an idea of just how difficult it was to clear ground. And I think it gives them a better appreciation for it. Just the sheer physical effort of getting up there, and also looking around and seeing how difficult it would be for command and control. That's the thing that I think I like to drive home when we go there.
For you, Pete, your landscape has changed the most of any of these battlefields we're talking about. So does that ring true for you as well?
Well, it does, because the landscape remains the same. Literally the terrain, I suppose, and certainly on the Somme battlefield there's been very little development. So there are very few changes. The woods, the roads, the villages are exactly where they would have been during the Great War. So the terrain's exactly the same. The landscape, not obviously in the Great War, most of it is destroyed. The soldiers are fighting over a quagmire, but you still get that same feel of what the soldiers could see when they stood up in the open, which wasn't always necessarily a good thing to do, certainly in the Great War. But when you stood up in the open and you look round, you're getting the same landscape that the soldiers saw 100+ years previously. So no, it is still very essential that you walk that ground, because it is still the same ground. And this ground, the landscape on the Western Front, gives up the relics constantly. So you're surrounded by fragments of those battlefields. So you definitely get that feel. But we can never reproduce what the soldiers went through because of the horror and the terror and the smells. But you're at least starting to get a feel about it, just a little fragment of what their experience was.
What about in Kokoda, David? Because it's again, it's a very tough environment. A lot of people do Kokoda because primarily for the physical experience, with also the history components. How much are you engaging with the history when you're doing that trek?
Well, there's a great example I have. You could be climbing up Brigade Hill. It's quite a climb, especially if you're coming from the southern side, and you turn around to your Papuan guide and you say, "How far to the top?" And they say, "Oh, not far." And you look back and you say, "Oh, is it going to be an hour?" "Yeah, about an hour." And you realize you're in Pacific time. Time does not exist. And there are moments like that, and people get frustrated. But those same little stories come up so much in the history. So whilst Pete's right, you can't recreate the bullets whizzing past and all that stuff, but those little moments, the funnier side, if you will, are things that you can do. And you'll be frustrated, but you'll look back with humour on it, just as the diggers did.
Mm. I can always remember the first time I went to Kokoda, I said to one of the guys, "How far?" And he said, "Oh, he goey. And I thought, how far is it going? We're never going to get there. In Vietnam, the closest we get is when we go to the village of Ben Ba, and that's where a battle was fought in a built-up area. And the built-up area is still there. It's just a bit more complicated than what it was back in 1968, or 69, sorry. And you can paint some of that, but it's being on the ground itself that's more important, I think.
Yeah. I think I enjoy it because I can take clients very often to an individual client to exactly a spot that they want to go to. If I've been given the information prior to a tour, to take somebody literally to within 50 meters perhaps of where their relative either fell or fought an action that they recall or remember. I mean, that is absolutely unbelievable when you can get that close. And I have that luxury on the Western Front that it was well plotted out. We've got all the maps and the trench maps and modern GPS systems that we can actually get there. And to me, that is probably the best part of guiding, is taking somebody to an actual location and saying, this is where your relative fought, or sadly, this is where he fell. And you can imagine the emotions connected with that. It's extraordinary.
Yeah, I agree. I remember taking a friend of mine back to where one of his schoolmates was killed in action. And it had changed a little bit with the local farming and agriculture, but we were still able to stand on that piece of ground. And as Matt said, for them, it was hallowed ground. And it's very important.
Extraordinary. Yeah, very.
Yeah, I agree. I've taken relatives, but in particular, one lady stands out. She didn't come to walk. She was on a non-trekking tour. Her father was killed and no known grave. She never knew her father because she was born post his death. And she'd never left Australia. But when she went there, she couldn't go to a grave. There was no grave to see, only a name on a plaque for the unknown. But when she went there and she came back, and this is a lady who, was near 80, and she went and, or near 70, and went to New Guinea, never been outside of Australia. And she told me when she come back, for her, that brought some closure. And whilst we can never take people back in time, you can go most of the way to give them part of the story. And I think visiting a battlefield is just that. You're getting the biggest piece of the puzzle away from the history books.
Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned that it's an important experience to talk to the native porters, Dave, and to connect with the local people. We should remember that as well. It's not just history books. It's not just dry history that belongs in the past. These are some pretty fascinating destinations. How important is it to connect with the local people and to get their perspectives on what the war meant to them in the area where they live?
It's immensely important. The thing I say to everybody, I can tell you, regurgitate the history, I can tell you the stories that the veterans told me, but I cannot tell you what it's like to be a Papua New Guinean growing up, living in Papua New Guinea. And I encourage everybody, because they're very shy, but once you speak to them and you open up to them, they open up to you. And many of them have stories which have been passed down from how the war impacted their family. In fact, I don't know too many of the guides that I walk with who in some way the war didn't touch them. Villages have moved, still on their same ground, but they are no longer in the same place that they were once because the war came in the way. And that legacy is something they're still living with. In fact, you go through villages and many of the clotheslines and fences, the pig fence to keep the pigs out of the vegetable garden, are made with the copper insulated wire that they used for the old phones. That's still there. The remnants of the war are not only there, but they're being used by the people. And that, when you point that out to people and they interact with the local people and see that, they realize how real it all becomes.
Yeah, we have the same here on the Western Front. We have the pickets that we use for holding the barbed wire up all over the battlefields. The farmers still use them for movable fencing. So you get the pickets and sometimes the insulators used for the telephone wires. They're being used all over. So it's fascinating to drive along and say, "Oh, look at that! Look at that!" And one of my favourite little bits of kit are the cylinders used for propelling the mortar tubes used for propelling gas cylinders, and they are used as gate guards to protect gates in front of farms, and they're everywhere. So it's still there. You're absolutely right. There are those relics of warfare on most battlefields. It's just spotting them and finding them that's the key.
Gary, we're going to have to wrap it up pretty soon, but I'm interested in that perspective for you, because when you go to Vietnam, obviously there's a lot of controversy involved in the war. You're meeting people who fought on the other side. People lost families. How important is it to engage with the local people in Vietnam?
Yeah, it's immensely important. To sort of underline that, when I first went back, I studied the Vietnamese language so I could do interviews, and because I wanted to find out what the Vietnamese thought about the Australians. And I asked a man who'd been in one of the Viet Cong main force regiments why he treated me as a former enemy the way he did, because there was no animosity, no angst, no anger at me. And he said it was because the Australians conducted themselves well during the war. We buried their dead. We took care of the wounded. We tried to do something for the people of South Vietnam in the villages by putting down wells and building bridges, etc. But the last thing he said was, we did not commit atrocities. And henceforth, they make the Australians very welcome. And what I constantly tell people is that at the end of the Vietnam War, there were 40 million people in Vietnam, the entire country of Vietnam. The population today is nearly 98 million. 68% of the people are under the age of 40. So it's a very young country. And they are only looking forward and not back. But the beauty of talking to them is that you find out what impact it had on their parents and their upbringing. And a lot of the guides that we use in Vietnam, the Vietnamese guides, have all got great stories to tell about how the war impacted on them. And we always endeavour to get that history of the Second Indochina War transported across to not just the war itself, but the way it impacted on the people.
Well, it's very well said, Gary. It's really important that we remember this isn't just about history. This is about engaging with a fascinating destination and fascinating people as well. Gentlemen, we can't wait to get back over there to see you all, to walk the ground with you once again, which we'll be doing in 2022. So thank you very much for your insights. It's been absolutely wonderful. I'd like to thank my great panel of historians who joined us for that special discussion. It really is vitally important that the historians walk the ground with on the battlefields, and we're so lucky to have Gary and to have Pete, to have David joining us to talk about their battlefields. Really quite amazing. Now, something I've been looking forward to now, it's the interactive part of the presentation. You will see on your screen a live Q&A button. If you want to send me questions now, we're going to answer your questions as well as we can. So send those through now. We've already had quite a few that have come in, so we're going to do our best to answer these questions. So we've had quite a few questions during the presentation about people wanting to research their family members and find out specifically what their father or grandfather did on the battlefields. It's a great question. We don't really have time to go into specifics now about each soldier, but what I will say is the best port of call is certainly the Australian War Memorial. That's the best place to go to. Either give them a call, their research centre, or go to the website at awm.gov.au, and you can do a full search for Australian soldiers there. Also, a few years ago, I did a video on YouTube which was called Researching an Australian Soldier. So go and look that one up. There's some great tips there on how to find information about researching soldiers. Another question that's come in is a question about Gallipoli. We didn't touch very much on Gallipoli during this presentation, but it's a for Australians. So we've got a question to visit Gallipoli or another time. It's a great question. A lot. It really depends. Reason for visiting Gallipoli, then definitely go that day. But if you want the peace and the tranquility and to have the place a little bit to yourself, I'd recommend it going another time of the year. So ideally, you could do 2 trips to Gallipoli. You do one where you can explore the battlefield and then go again for Anzac Day for that amazing service. So either way, we can certainly help you at whatever time of the year you want to visit. Another question that's come in here is someone's asking, what tours am I specifically leading in 2022? I don't lead many tours anymore, but if you do want to come to the battlefields with me, the tour I'd recommend is the Mat McLachlan Signature Tour, which is happening in September next year. Now, this is going to be a fantastic tour. Pete Smith, that you saw on the presentation, will be joining me on that tour, and the two of us will be leading a tour across the Western Front battlefields through France and Belgium. So that's in September next year. You can find all the details on our website. There's only 30 places on that tour, and it's already about half full. So if you want to join us on that very limited tour, then please go to the website and check those details out. Also, another tour that I'm leading, well, there's a cruise that we are to the battlefields of New Guinea at the end of next year in November, which is going to be very exciting. I will be along with a bunch of other historians. We're going to go to some amazing places in New Guinea, to places like Milne Bay, to Rabaul, these wonderful battlefields that Australians fought during the Second World War. What a great way to do it, by ship. And I'll be joining the historians on that ship, and we'll be doing a conference, a World War II conference on the sea days on that voyage. So that is a very good opportunity if you'd like to join me as well. And also, some of you may know from my social media posts, I'm currently writing a book about the Cowra breakout, the famous breakout prisoner of war camp by the Japanese in 1944 in the town of Cowra in New South Wales. And I'll be leading a small tour in October next year, just to go out for the weekend after that book comes out. I'll be leading a small tour to go out and see those sites around Cowra, so I'm looking forward to doing that tour as well. So those are the tours I am leading next year. Someone else saw David talking about Kokoda and has written that they're interested in visiting Kokoda, but they don't quite think they're up for the 11-day trek through the mountains. And I certainly can't blame them for that. So is there an easier option? And the answer is yes. We are one of the few companies that offers a Kokoda without trekking tour, which means you start in Port Moresby, you see all the sites in Port Moresby, you see the start of the track and go to Bomana War Cemetery, some of those great sites that David talked about in his presentation, and then we fly you into Kokoda village. And so you see the track. So you don't get to see some of the more torturous parts of the Owen Stanleys in the middle of the track. You see both ends of the track, and most importantly, you get to participate in commemorative services at Kokoda. So we're running a tour, Kokoda without trekking, which will take place for Anzac Day next year in 2022, and also in the year for the anniversary, the 8th anniversary of the Kokoda campaign. So if you're interested in going to Kokoda and you don't feel you can do that arduous 11-day trek, that's the tour for you. Question here has come in, are there any plans to reschedule the P&O cruise, the World War II cruise? Yes, that was the one I just referred to, so that's place in November. All things going well, depending on schedules, that will be in November 2022. So we're looking forward to getting up to New Guinea and seeing some of those World War II sites. So we've got some other questions coming through here. Are we continuing the battle walks podcast post-COVID? Excellent question. The answer is yes, we will. Obviously, we'll do it, but it's going to transition slightly. We'll still do the virtual tours that Pete and I enjoy doing, but we'll also be doing more live stuff from the battlefields as we get back over there. So I know that a very popular part of the podcast is Pete live from the battlefields of the Western Front. So we'll be doing more of those as we go on. So check that out wherever you download podcasts, and you can hear Pete Smith and I walking the battlefields in a virtual sense. A question here, when is Pete doing a Bullecourt tour? Bullecourt is one of the most famous battlefields, one of the key sites. The answer is the tour that Pete does includes Bullecourt because it's such an important site. So I have no plans for a specific tour just dedicated to Bullecourt, but we visit Bullecourt on every do. So whether it's a short 4-day explorer tour from Paris or a longer tour for Anzac Day or the signature tour, will definitely be Bullecourt. So just more questions coming in here. We've had a couple of questions about other fields like Crete, for example, and Hellfire Pass. We tours to those battlefields. We were limited in the time we could give them today. Crete is obviously the anniversary is this year, so a very important battle. We do tours to Crete for anyone that's heading over to Greece. Also Hellfire Pass is quite common. We do that for Anzac Day, and also at other times of the year you can do a private tour. And so more questions coming in. We've got one here that's an interesting one. Are you offering anything for professional soldiers to enhance their understanding of the enduring nature of war? We do a lot of work with people from the Defence Force. It's quite an important respect and honour and of today as well as the ones from the past. So we certainly look forward to welcoming veterans for the tours, and our historians, many of our historians are previously military people themselves, so they're very well equipped to deal with veterans and to help them get the best out of the battlefield. So we look forward to welcoming military people onto our tours and showing them the battlefields where previous generations of military people fought. That is about all we've got time for. Thank you very much for sending in your questions. Any that we didn't have time to answer now, we will certainly get. I will read through those and reply. Also remember that we are recording this event, so if you want to watch it again, you can see it live. And thank you very much for enjoyed it as much as I have. It's been a very special Remembrance Day. Hopefully next year we'll be able to Remembrance Day on the battlefields. But in the meantime, I hope you've enjoyed this virtual experience with us. And now, Remembrance Day, I'd like to leave you with a video that I shot the last time I was on the battlefields of the Western Front. And this is one of the most important memorials that you will see on the Western Front. It's a memorial we visit on all of our tours and a service we participate in as a group. It's a really wonderful commemorative service that takes place every night in the town of Ypres. So I'd like to show you a video now which really is important Remembrance Day. So please join me as we commemorate the last post at the Menin Gate.
Visiting the Menin Gate in daylight is a very personal experience. You often have the whole place to yourself, but at night the memorial transforms.
It's approaching 8 p.m. and tonight, like every night, crowds have started to gather at the Menin Gate for something very, very special. Let's go and have a look. The Ypres Fire Brigade play the last post in honour of the men recorded on these walls around us. They do it every day, rain or shine. The only time they stopped was the 4 years during German occupation in the Second World War, and they restarted the service the day the town was liberated. It's one of the most special ceremonies on the Western Front. last post, of course, is a very moving part of this service, but for me personally, it's the pipes that always get me.